Welcome back to our podcast, Let's Talk About Labor. This podcast aims to help farmers and ag businesses connect with other ag businesses specifically to hear and learn about their experiences and challenges related to labor and the strategies they have used to overcome these challenges. We talk about various topics such as U.S. temporary foreign visa programs, mechanization and automation, and worker recruitment and retention strategies, among other topics. Different agencies and organizations have partnered with us to make this podcast possible, including the Southern Risk Management Education Center, GAP Connections, the U.S. Department of Agriculture SCRI program, the Tennessee Department of Labor and Workforce Development, and the University of Florida Farm Labor Supervisor Certification program. My name is Margarita Velandia, and I'm a professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of Tennessee. Um, would like to introduce our guest for today's episode. Tom Bortnyk, Senior Vice President and General Counsel at másLabor. másLabor is a business to business consulting firm that provides comprehensive services from employers navigating the U.S. H-2A and H-2B temporary foreign worker visa programs. The company helps business, particularly in agriculture and non agricultural industries like landscaping, secure legal and reliable seasonal labor by managing the complex government application process, ensuring regulatory compliance, and assisting with recruitment and logistics. In today's episode, Tom will discuss with us the recent changes to the H-2A program, specifically the new methodology to determine the adverse effect wage rate. It is important to note that in fiscal year 2024, over 80% of the H-2A job certifications requested by Tennessee agricultural employers rather than H-2A labor contractors were handled by a third party, such as an agent or a law firm, just like másLabor. Tom, thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. We are really excited to have you as a guest on our podcast.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. So let's go ahead and start with the first question. Um, First, Tom, I would like you to briefly discuss, in simple terms, the proposed changes to the methodology used to determine the adverse effect wage rate. I would also appreciate if you could provide specific information on how this rule will affect the wage rates paid by Tennessee growers.
Sure, happy to weigh in on that. So it's important to understand kind of how we got here. Historically, H-2A wages were set by survey data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So every year, USDA would go out, survey farms all around the country, and try to come up with a wage rate that reflects sort of all traditional farm jobs. What the Biden administration did several years ago was introduce a bifurcated wage methodology. And that methodology divided wages between sort of standard farm jobs, your basic farm workers, ag equipment operators, packing house workers. It divided those and separated those from sort of non-traditional occupations, occupations that would include things like truck drivers, perhaps supervisors, or more skilled and technical positions on the farm. And that bifurcated wage methodology was subject to a lot of controversy. There were several lawsuits over the wage methodology, and ultimately a court struck down most of that rule, and so it is no longer operative. What the Trump administration has done, kind of in this new post-lawsuit environment, is try to preserve some aspects of that rule while making modifications that address some of the issues that came up in the lawsuit. So that bifurcation is still in place under the new rule. It still divides occupations between sort of standard and non-standard occupations. Probably the biggest change related to that is instead of a one duty test where one single duty from a non-standard occupation can throw you into a higher wage category, The Trump version of the rule actually uses a primary duties test, where it's looking to what the worker is doing the majority of work days. So it's really trying to drill down and have a more accurate reflection of what workers are doing in the field or on the job. Kind of the second aspect of this is the wage data itself. So one of the kind of primary motivations for getting this rule out there was the fact that USDA is no longer doing the survey that serves as the baseline for the wages. USDA has been doing that survey for many decades, and they announced that they were terminating it. So, in order to find a new source of wage data, the Department of Labor sort of had to act to fill that vacuum. And what they've done is they've looked to the occupational and employment wage statistics. So that's a different survey. It works very similarly to how the USDA survey was conducted. The primary difference is that it's conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it surveys a much broader sampling of American businesses. Basically, every private sector employer in the United States is subject to that survey. So they are making changes to that survey, and they will start to include agricultural data in that survey going forward, and then that will serve as the primary wage source for the H-2A program. The other kind of big change, I'll name two of them. One of the other big changes is a division between skill levels. So in the kind of historic version of the wage methodology, all agricultural jobs were treated the same. You basically had one wage rate apply to all workers, regardless of the complexity of the task. What this new wage rule does is create tiers. So you have skill level one, which is for entry level job opportunities that do not require any kind of specialized training, a very limited or modest amount of work experience, and no particular education requirements. And paying that at a lower rate than you would a skill level two, which is a more advanced occupation, one that does have an experience requirement or a substantial amount of training or specialized experience needed to do the job, or perhaps has other requirements as well, like supervisory duties. So really, it's differentiating between entry level and more experienced job positions. The third major change that's part of this rule is having a wage differential between U.S. farm workers who are here, you know, working in these agricultural jobs and H-2A workers that are coming here on a seasonal basis. The thing is that most, under the program, housing is a requirement for any non-local workers. So employers are obligated to provide free housing to workers coming from out of the area. In practice, what this means is that most U.S. farm workers that are in similar occupations do not enjoy free housing, whereas the H-2A workers that are coming from out of country typically do enjoy free housing. So what the Department of Labor has done is calculate the relative value of that non-monetary benefit, try to figure out what that housing benefit is really worth, and then allow employers to pay a wage differential to where U.S. workers can earn slightly higher than what the H-2A workers do because the H-2A workers are enjoying that free benefit. And that is also a major change to how the program has typically been done in the past.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, Tom. You kind of like make it concise on the three main things, the tiers, the data being used, and then providing a value to that housing benefit that H-2A workers have that local workers do not actually enjoy. Um,
Exactly.
and then, do you have any information specifically to how the wage rates that will be paid here in Tennessee? Because I know each state will have kind of like differences, right? On
Sure.
So I don't know if you can follow up a little bit on that, Tom.
Yeah, absolutely. So under the old AWR methodology, what had been in place effectively since, the Obama era version of the regulations, the old methodology, Tennessee was paying 15.87 per hour. And that was applicable to all workers. It was applicable to workers regardless of skill level and regardless, in many cases, of occupation. Obviously, the Biden era rule bifurcated that, so it was only applicable to standard occupations. But 1587 is really where the old methodology would place the wage rate. Under the new methodology, it really depends on skill level. But for standard occupations, skill level one would be $12.44 for US workers, with the H-2A wage rate being 10.84 per hour. So again, you see that slight wage differential based on the value of the housing. One important note, though, is that for skill level two, the wage rate for US workers is actually higher than it was under the old methodology. So under the skill level two framework, US workers would actually earn 16.64 per hour. So, you know, essentially higher than it was under the old methodology. And even with the H-2A pay differential, H-2A workers would still be making 15.04 per hour. So really, I think the biggest change for Tennessee employers is the fact that for skill level two occupations, it's pretty comparable to what it was under the old rule. Where I think the biggest difference is under this rule is that Tennessee growers, to the extent that they do have more entry-level job positions, actually have a lower wage floor. So they'd be able to pay a lower rate for entry-level job opportunities. And what I think the real intent of the Department of Labor, if you really boil it down, what they're trying to do is have a more market-based approach to wages. And it sort of intuitively makes sense that you would, pay more to more experienced workers or more complex tasks and have a lower floor for more sort of basic farm work taking place. And what I think the natural consequence of this will be is that really you have a more accurate reflection of the true labor market, but also you provide some degree of upward mobility. Having a lower floor for entry level workers means that eventually, perhaps, those workers could work their way into more skilled job positions that do carry a higher wage rate, as opposed to sort of a one size fits all approach.
Excellent information, Tom. Very clear for our audience. Now, following up on that, extension personnel here in our state have communicated with me about grower concerns regarding how to determine the wage rate that will pay and how this wage rate will affect the relationship they have with their workers. As you explained, for those skill level workers, the floor is kind of like lower than the 1587 that they were paying, for example, fiscal year 2025.
Hmm.
So they have that concern. So could you please give us like examples of strategies to use to determine that wage rate to pay H-2A workers? And could you also discuss the strategies you are recommending growers to use or that growers themselves are using to communicate with workers about the new wage rates?
Sure. So one thing that's rather interesting to me, looking at our client base, and obviously we do have clients in all 50 states, including a substantial number of them in Tennessee. One thing that is universally true virtually all over the country is the fact that paying the lower rate that is now allowed under the law is not necessarily what employers are doing. Uh, Growers and ranchers, even though they may have the option of paying a lower wage, they may choose to pay above what the law requires them to. And they would do this, one, to attract better talent, right? I mean, they're competing in the labor market for the best workers and the most productive workers, but also for the workers that they've been working with for many years, they don't want to cut their pay. It creates a morale problem, it creates a retention problem. And so many of our clients, a pretty sizable percentage of them, are voluntarily choosing to pay a wage rate that is more aligned with what they've paid historically. And in many cases, they're just reserving that lower pay rate as sort of the entry level floor for newly hired workers. So we've seen both, employers make voluntary choices to pay higher than that across the board. We've also seen them offer a pay differential for returning workers to incentivize them to come back the following year and to incentivize them to, if they have upward mobility, they're going to be more productive. They're going to be wanting to do a good job, so they get invited back and can actually earn a higher rate of pay. So in practice, I do think there will be some who will take advantage of the lower rates. That's for certain. And they're certainly free to do that. I think what's going to be interesting to me is you're going to see a greater range of strategies that growers take when determining pay rates. So it is going to be a little bit more market driven as far as how low wages can go, and more importantly, what growers need to pay and where they need to keep wages to remain competitive in the labor market, to make sure that they are attracting the best workers and that they can retain the workers that have been coming year after year.
That's very interesting, Tom. So before like working with these growers, a lot of them talk about labor costs being one of the biggest barriers. It seems like they have more flexibility now, but it's going to be about more a strategy for retention, right? Once you have that baseline that is
Sure.
lower, it's more about how you attract the best workers to your farm. So I think that it seems like that will be the key strategy moving forward, right, Tom?
Yeah, I think so. And of course, program cost, especially, the cost of labor, but also the cost of housing are the top deal breakers for employers who are thinking about getting into the program but aren't ready to pull the trigger yet. It also is the top reason why people decide not to do the program, right? Because those are costs, and depending on what commodity group you're in, you may not be able to have control over your pricing. So it's not as easy as just passing those costs on to consumers. Often those program costs are just eating into the grower's bottom line. So I think having a lower floor, one, it doesn't necessarily mean lower wages for workers. That's not the exact consequence. Um, I think what it does mean is more flexibility, as you say. And certainly growers are going to have to compete in the labor market. I think what this wage rule does is afford greater flexibility and more importantly, flexibility when it comes to skill level and what jobs workers are doing on the farm. But it really just allows them to structure their business in a way that makes sense for them, as opposed to having a top-down approach to wages that was in place under the previous methodology.
Yeah. Yeah, that's excellent information, Tom. We're almost at the end of the episode, and I want to finalize this episode by asking you to briefly discuss any other changes to the H-2A program you think are important for growers to be aware of, including potential changes you expect to the new adverse effect wage rate methodology, if anything. If you think that moving forward, then there might be additional changes that growers need to be aware of.
Sure. Well, we very well might see some changes to the wage methodology. The current methodology that is in place right now under the Trump administration was released as an interim final rule, which means there is still a public comment period. It actually ended earlier this month. And so the Department of Labor will be evaluating stakeholder feedback to determine what changes, if any, they plan to make to the rule. And of course, stakeholders range from farm worker advocates to growers and ranchers themselves to trade associations. So it's a pretty broad swath of the agricultural sector that's weighing in and making suggestions on ways to improve the rule. So we very well may see further changes to that. We've also seen a lot of other changes at the Department of Labor, especially, including some new flexibility on staggered crossings. In the old days, you had to file a separate H-2A application for every single start date you have during your season, uh, meaning, you have a lot of extra paperwork if you want workers to kind of trickle in as the season ramps up. Under the new guidelines issued by the Department of Labor, it's actually possible to do that on a single H-2A application. So really reducing kind of the paperwork burden on growers. And there's also been efforts to streamline the process. One thing that has, happened fairly recently is the Department of Labor has a new agreement with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to allow more seamless transition from one government agency to the other as part of that filing process. And so there's now an online filing option on what had previously been a paperwork. You print out a stack of paper and you mail it to a service center across the country. They're really trying to move towards digitization, which should not only lower cost and the administrative burden for growers, but really help the process speed up and increase the odds of timely worker arrival. And that's something, just last week I was in Vegas for the NCAE conference. Secretary of Labor Lori Chavez DeRemer was there. And those are some of the things that she spoke to as being very high on the administration's priority list to really try to make the program more accessible to growers. So I would say that we can expect a lot more changes like that in the coming years.
Well, that's excellent news for everybody, right, Tom? Uh,
Exactly.
so again, Tom, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. This has been a great conversation and very valuable information for our audience. And I guess I'll see you all in the next episode. Thank you, Tom.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.